Blindsight, Part 8, by Peter Watts. Narrated by Zachary Reed. Why should man expect his prayer for mercy to be heard by what is above him when he shows no mercy to what is under him? Pierre Trubetskoy. The thing is, Chelsea said, this whole first-person thing takes effort. You have to care enough to try, you know? I've been working my ass off on this relationship. I've been working so hard, but you just don't seem to care. She thought she was breaking the news. She thought I hadn't seen it coming because I hadn't said anything. I'd probably seen it before she had. I hadn't said anything because I'd been scared of giving her an opening. I felt sick to my stomach. I care about you, I said. As much as you care about anything, she admitted. But sometimes you're fine, Cygnus, sometimes you're wonderful to be around, and whenever anything gets the least bit intense, you just go away and leave this battle computer running your body, and I just can't deal with it anymore. I stared at the butterfly on the back of her hand. Its wings flexed and folded, lazy and iridescent. I wondered how many of those tattoos she had. I'd seen 5 of them on different body parts, albeit only one at a time. I thought about asking her, but this didn't seem like the right moment. You can be so brutal sometimes, she was saying. I know you don't mean to be, but I don't know, maybe I'm your pressure release valve or something. Maybe you have to submerge yourself so much on the job that everything just builds up and you need some kind of punching bag. Maybe that's why you say the things you do. She waited for me to say anything now. I've been honest, I said. Yeah. Pathologically, have you ever had a negative thought that you haven't said out loud? Her voice trembled, but her eyes, for once, stayed dry. I guess it's as much my fault as yours, maybe more. I could tell you were disconnected from the day we met. I guess on some level I always saw it coming. Why even try, then, if you knew we were just going to crash and burn like this? Oh, Cygnus, aren't you the one who says everyone crashes and burns eventually? Aren't you the one that says it never lasts? Mom and Dad lasted. Longer than this, anyway. I frowned, astonished that I'd even let the thought form in my head. Chelsea read the silence as a wounded one. I guess maybe I thought I could help, you know? Help fix whatever made you so angry all the time. The butterfly was starting to fade. I'd never seen that happen before. Do you understand what I'm saying? She asked. Sure, I'm a fixer-upper. Siri, you wouldn't even get a tweak when I offered. You were so scared of being manipulated, you wouldn't even try a basic cascade. You're the one guy I've met who might be truly, eternally unfixable. Maybe that's even something to be proud of. I opened my mouth and closed it. She gave me a sad smile. Nothing, Siri? Nothing at all? There was a time when you always knew exactly what to say. She looked back at some earlier version of me. Now I wonder if you actually meant any of it. That's not fair. No, she pursed her lips. No, it isn't. That's not really what I'm trying to say. I guess it's not so much that you don't mean any of it, it's more like you don't know what any of it means. The color was gone from the wings. The butterfly was a delicate charcoal dusting, almost motionless. I'll do it now, I said. I'll get the tweaks. If it's that important to you, I'll do it now. It's too late, Siri. I'm used up. Maybe she wanted me to call her back. All these words ending in question marks, all these significant silences. Maybe she was giving me the opportunity to plead for my case, to beg for another chance. Maybe she wanted a reason to change her mind. I could have tried. Please don't, I could have said. I'm begging you. I never meant to drive you away completely, just a little, just to a safer distance. Please. In 30 long years, the only time I haven't felt worthless was when we were together. But when I looked up again, the butterfly was gone, and so was she, taking all baggage with her. She carried doubt and guilt for having led me on. She left believing that our incompatibility was no one's fault, that she tried as hard as she could, even that I had under the tragic weight of all my issues. She left, and maybe she didn't even blame me, and I never even knew who'd made that final decision. I was good at what I did. I was so damned good I did it without even meaning to. My God, did you hear that? Susan James bounced around the drum like a pronking wildebeest in the half-gravity. I could see the whites of her eyes from 90 degrees away. Check your feeds, the pens! I checked. One scrambler afloat, the other still jammed into its corner. James landed at my side with a 2-footed thump, wobbling for balance. Turn the sound up! The hissing of the air conditioners, the clank of distant machinery echoing along the spine, Theseus' usual intestinal rumblings, nothing else. Okay, they're not doing it now. James brought up a split-screen window and threw it into reverse. There, she pronounced, replaying the record with the audio cranked and filtered. In the right side of the window, the floating scrambler had drifted so that the tip of one outstretched arm brushed against the wall that adjoined the other pen. In the left side, the huddled scrambler remained unmoving. I thought I heard something, just for an instant, the brief buzz of an insect, perhaps if the nearest insect hadn't been 5 trillion kilometers away. Replay that. Slow it down. A buzz, definitely. A vibration. Way down. A click train, squirted from a dolphin's forehead. Farting lips. No, let me. James bullied into Cunningham's headspace and yanked the slider to the left. Tick, 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 tick. Doppler down near absolute zero, it went on for almost a minute. Total elapsed real time was about half a second. Cunningham zoomed the split screen. The huddled scrambler had remained motionless, except for the rippling of its cuticle and the undulation of its free arms. But before, I'd only seen 8 arms. Now I could make out the bony spur of a 9th from peeking from behind the central mass. A 9th arm, curled up and hidden from view, tick-tick-ticking while another creature casually leaned against the other side of the wall. Now there was nothing. The floating scrambler had drifted aimlessly back to the center of its enclosure. James's eyes shone. We've got to check the rest of... But Theseus had been watching and was way ahead of us. It had already searched the archives and served up the results. 3 similar exchanges over 2 days, ranging in duration from 1/10 of a second to almost 2. They're talking, James said. Cunningham shrugged, a forgotten cigarette burning down between his fingers. So do a lot of things, and at that rate of exchange, they're not exactly doing calculus. You'd get as much information out of a dancing honeybee. That's nonsense, and you know it, Robert. What I know is that honeybees don't deliberately hide what they're saying. Honeybees don't develop whole new modes of communication configured specifically to confound observers. That's flexible, Robert. That's intelligent. And what if it is, Forget for a moment the inconvenient fact that these things don't even have brains. I really don't think you've thought this through. Of course I have. Indeed. Then what are you so happy about? Don't you know what this means? Sudden prickling on the back of my neck. I looked around. I looked up. Yuka Sadasti had appeared in the center of the drum, eyes gleaming, teeth bared, watching us. Cunningham followed my gaze and nodded. I'd wager it does. There was no way to learn what they'd whispered across that wall. Enough, parse every tick and tap they'd exchanged, but you can't decipher a code without some idea of content. We had patterns of sound that could have meant anything. We had creatures whose grammar and syntax, if their mode of communication even contained such attributes, were unknown, and perhaps unknowable. We had creatures smart enough to talk and smart enough to hide this fact. No matter how much we wanted to learn, they were obviously unwilling to teach us. Not without, how had I put it, negative reinforcement. It was Yuka Sadasti who made the decision. We did it on his orders, as we did everything else. But after the word had come down, after Sadasti had disappeared into the night, and Bates had retreated down the spine, and Robert Cunningham had returned to his studies at the back of the drum, I was the one Susan James was left with. The first to speak the vile thought aloud, the official witness to posterity. I was the one she looked at and looked away from, her surfaces hard and refractory. And then she started. This is how you break down a wall. Start with 2 beings. They can be human if you like, but that's hardly a prerequisite. All that matters is that they know how to talk among themselves. Separate them. Let them see each other. Let them speak. Perhaps a window between their cages. Perhaps an audio feed. Let them practice the art of conversation in their own chosen way. Hurt them. It may take a while to figure out how. Some may shrink from fire, others some toxic gas or liquid. Some creatures may be invulnerable to blowtorches and grenades, but shriek in terror at the threat of ultrasonic sound. You have to experiment, and when you discover just the right stimulus, the optimum balance between pain and injury, you must inflict it without remorse. You leave them an escape hatch, of course. That's the very point of the exercise. Give one of your subjects the means to end the pain, but give the other the information required to use it. To one you might present a single shape, while showing the other a whole selection. The pain will stop when the being with the menu chooses the item its partner has seen. So let the games begin. Watch your subjects squirm. If, When they trip the off switch, you'll know at least some of the information was exchanged. And if you record everything that passed between them, you'll start to get some idea of how they exchanged it. When they solve one puzzle, give them a new one. Mix things up. Switch their roles. See how they do with circles versus squares. Try them out on factorials and Fibonacci's. Continue until Rosetta Stone results. This is how you communicate with a fellow intelligence. You hurt it, and keep on hurting it, until you can distinguish the speech from the screams. Susan James, congenital optimist, high priestess of the Church of the Healing Word, was best qualified to design and execute the protocols. Now at her command the scramblers writhed. They pulled themselves around their cages in elliptical loops, desperately seeking any small corner free of stimulus. James had piped the feat into consensus, although there was no mission-critical reason for Thesia's whole crew to bear witness to the interrogation. "Let them block it at their ends," she said quietly, "if they want to." For all his reluctance to accept that these were beings, intelligent and aware, Cunningham had named the prisoners. Stretch tended to float spread-eagled, Clench was the balled-up corner-hugger. Susan, playing her own part in this perverse role reversal, had simply numbered them 1 and 2. It wasn't that Cunningham's choices were too cheesy for her to stomach, or that she objected to the slave names on principle. She'd just fallen back on the oldest trick in the torturer's handbook, the one that lets you go home to your family after work and play with your children and sleep at night. Never humanize your victims. It shouldn't have been such an issue when dealing with methane-breathing Medusae. I guess every little bit helped. Biotelemetry danced across the headspace beside each alien, luminous annotation shuddering through thin air. I had no idea what constituted normal readings for these creatures, but I couldn't imagine these jagged spikes passing for anything but bad news. The creatures themselves seethed subtly with fine mosaics in blue and gray, fluid patterns rippling across their cuticles. Perhaps it was a reflexive reaction to the microwaves. For all we knew, it was a mating display. More likely, they were screaming. James killed the microwaves. In the left-hand enclosure, a yellow square dimmed. In the right, an identical icon nested among others had never lit. The pigment flowed faster in the wake of the onslaught. The arms slowed but didn't stop. They swept back and forth like listless skeletal eels. Baseline exposure, 5 seconds, 350 watts. She spoke for the record. Another affectation. Theseus recorded every breath on record, every trickle of current to 5 decimal places. Repeat. The icon lit up. More tile patterns, flash flooding across alien skin. But this time, neither alien moved from where it was. Their arms continued to squirm slightly, a torqued, trembling variation on the undulation that they affected at rest. The telemetry was as harsh as ever, though. They learned helplessness fast enough, I reflected. I glanced at Susan. "Are you going to do this all by yourself?" Her eyes were bright and wet as she killed the current. Clench's icon dimmed. Stretches remained dormant. I cleared my throat. "I mean, who else is going to do this, Siri? Yuka? You? The rest of the gang. Sasha could..." "Sasha?" She stared at me. "Siri, I created them. Do you think I did this so I could hide behind them so I could force them to do things like this?" She shook her head. "I'm not bringing them out. Not for this. I wouldn't do that to my worst enemy." She turned away from me. There were drugs she could have taken, neuroinhibitors to wash away the guilt, short-circuit it right down to the molecules. Sadasti had offered them up as if he were tempting some solitary messiah in the desert. James had refused him and would not say why. "Repeat," she said. The current flickered on, then off. "Repeat," she said again. Not a twitch. I pointed. "I see it," she said. Clench had pressed the tip of one arm against the touchpad. The icon there glowed like a candle flame. 6.5 minutes later, they'd graduated from yellow squares to time-lapse 4-dimensional polyhedrons. It took them as long to distinguish between two 26-faceted shifting solids, differing by one facet in a single frame, as it took them to tell the difference between a yellow square and a red triangle. Intricate patterns played across their surfaces the whole time, dynamic needlepoint mosaics flickering almost too fast to see. "Fuck," James whispered. "Could be splinter skills." Cunningham joined us in consensus, although his body remained halfway around biomed. "Splinter skills," she repeated dully. "Savantism. Hyper-performance at one kind of calculation doesn't necessarily connote high intelligence." "I know what splinter skills are, Robert. I just think you're wrong. Prove it. So she gave up on geometry and told the scramblers that 1 + 1 = 2. Evidently they knew that already. 10 minutes later they were predicting 10-digit prime numbers on demand. She showed them a sequence of two-dimensional shapes. They picked the next one in the series from a menu of subtly different alternatives. She denied them multiple choice, showed the beginning of a whole new sequence, and taught them to draw on the touch-sensitive interface with the tips of their arms. They finished that series in precise freehand, rendered a chain of logical descendants ending with a figure that led inexorably back to the starting point. These aren't drones. James's voice caught in her throats. This is all just crunching, Cunningham said. Millions of computer programs do it without ever waking up. They're intelligent, Robert. They're smarter than us. Maybe they're smarter than Yuka. And why can't you just admit it? I could see it all over her. Isaac would have admitted it. Because they don't have the circuitry, Cunningham insisted. How could... I don't know how, she cried. That's your job. All I know is that I'm torturing beings that can think rings around us. Not for much longer, at least, once you figure out the language. She shook her head. Robert, I haven't a clue about the language. We've been at it for 4 hours, haven't we? The gang's all here. Language databases 4,000 years thick, all the latest linguistic algorithms. And we know exactly what they're saying. We're watching every possible way they could be saying it, right down to the angstrom. Precisely. So, I've got nothing. I know they're talking through pigment mosaics. There might even be something in the way they move those bristles, but I can't find the pattern. I can't even follow how they count, much less tell them I'm sorry. Nobody spoke for a while. Bates watched us from the galley on our ceiling, but made no attempt to join the proceedings. On consensus, the reprieved scramblers floated in their cages like multi-armed martyrs. Well, Cunningham said at last, since this seems to be the day for bad news, here's mine. They're dying. James put her face in her hand. It's not your interrogation, for whatever that's worth, the biologist continued. As far as I can determine, some of their metabolic pathways are just missing. Obviously, you just haven't found them yet. That was Bates, speaking up from across the drum. No, Cunningham said, slowly and distinctly. Obviously, those parts aren't available to the organism. Because they're falling apart pretty much the same way you'd expect one of us to. If all the mitotic spindles in our cells just vanished out of the cytoplasm, for example. As far as I can tell, they started deteriorating the moment we took them off Rorschach. Susan looked up. Are you saying they left part of their biochemistry behind? Some essential nutrient, Bates suggested. They're not eating. Yes to the linguist, no to the major. Cunningham fell silent. I glanced across the drum to see him sucking on a cigarette. I think a lot of the cellular processes in these things are mediated externally. I think the reason I can't find any genes in my biopsies is because they don't have any. So what do they have instead? Bates asked. Turing morphogens. Blank looks, subtitling looks. Cunningham explained anyway. A lot of biology doesn't use genes. Sunflowers look the way they do because of purely physical buckling stress. You get Fibonacci sequences and golden ratios everywhere in nature, and there's no gene codes for them. It's all just mechanical interactions. Take a developing embryo. The genes say start growing or stop growing, but the number of digits in vertebrae result from the mechanics of cells bumping up against other cells. Those mitotic spindles I mentioned? Absolutely essential for replication in every eukaryotic cell, and they accrete like crystals without any genetic involvement. You'd be surprised how much of life is like that. But you still need genes, Bates protested, walking around to join us. Genes just establish the starting conditions to enable the process. The structure that proliferates afterwards doesn't need specific instructions. It's classic emergent complexity. We've known about it for over a century. Another drag on the stick. Or even longer. Darwin cited honeycomb way back in the 1800s. Honeycomb, Bates repeated. Perfect hexagonal tubes in a packed array. Bees are hardwired to lay them down, but how does an insect know enough geometry to lay down a precise hexagon? It doesn't. It's programmed to chew up wax and spit it out while turning on its axis, and that generates a circle. Put a bunch of bees on the same surface, chewing side by side, and the circles butt against each other, to form each other into hexagons, which just happen to be more efficient for close packing anyway. Bates pounced. But bees are programmed, genetically. You misunderstand. Scramblers are the honeycomb. Rorschach is the bees, Jates murmured. Cunningham nodded. Rorschach is the bees. And I don't think Rorschach's magnetic fields are counter-intrusion mechanisms at all. I think they're part of the life support system. I think they mediate and regulate a good chunk of scrambler metabolism. What we've got back in the hold is a couple of creatures dragged out of their element and holding their breath, and they can't hold it forever. How long? James asked. How should I know? If I'm right, I'm not even dealing with complete organisms here. Guess, Bates said. He shrugged. A few days. Maybe. That which does not kill us makes us stranger. Trevor Goodchild. You still don't vote, Sodasti said. We would not be releasing the prisoners. Too risky. Out here in the endless wastelands of the Ort, there was no room for live and let live. Never mind what the other has done or what it hasn't. Think of what it could do, if it were just a little stronger. Think of what it might have done if we had arrived as late as we were supposed to. You look at Rorschach and perhaps you see an embryo or a developing child, alien beyond comprehension perhaps, but not guilty, not by default. But what if those are the wrong eyes? What if you should be seeing an omnipotent murdering god, a planet killer, not yet finished, vulnerable only now and for a little longer? There was no vampire opacity to that logic, no multidimensional black boxes for humans to shrug at and throw up their hands. There was no excuse for the failure to find fault with Sodasti's reasoning, beyond the fact that his reasoning was without fault. That made it worse. The others, I knew, would rather have had to take something on faith. But Sodasti had an alternative to capture release, one he evidently considered much safer. It took an act of faith to accept that reasoning, at least. By any sane measure, it verged on suicide. Now, Theseus gave birth by cesarean. These progeny were far too massive to fit through the canal at the end of the spine. The ship shat them as if constipated, directly into the hold. Great monstrous things, bristling with muzzles and antennae. Each stood 3 or 4 times my height, a pair of massive rust-colored cubes, every surface infested with topography. Armor plating would hide most of it prior to deployment, of course. Ribbons of piping and conduit, ammunition reservoirs, and shark-tooth rows of radiator fins, all to disappear beneath smooth reflective shielding. Only a few island landmarks would rise above that surface. Comports, thrust nozzles, targeting arrays. And gun ports, of course. These things spat fire and brimstone from a half-dozen mouths apiece. But for the time being, they were just mechanical fetuses, half-extruded, their planes and angles a high-contrast jigsaw of light and shadow in the harsh white glow of the hold's floodlamps. I turned from the port. That's got to take our substrate stockpiles down a bit. Shielding the carapace was worse. Bates monitored construction through a dedicated flat screen built right into the fab bulkhead. Practicing, perhaps. We'd be losing our inlays as soon as the orbit changed. We're tapping out, though. Might have to grab one of the local rocks before long. Huh. I looked back into the hold. You think they're necessary? Doesn't matter what I think. You're a bright guy, Siri. Why can't you figure that out? It matters to me. That means it matters to Earth. Which might mean something if Earth was calling the shots. Some subtext was legible no matter how deep in the system you were. I tacked to port. How about Sodasti and the captain, then? Any thoughts? You're usually a bit more subtle. That much was true. It's just, Susan was the one that caught Stretch and Clench tapping back and forth, right? Bates winced at the names. So? Well, some might think it odd that Theseus wouldn't have seen it first, since quantum computers are supposed to be so proficient pattern matching. Sodasti took the quantum modules offline. The onboard's been running in classical mode since before we even made orbit. Why? Noisy environment. Too much risk of decoherence. Quantum computers are finicky things. Surely the onboard shielded. Theseus is shielded. Bates nodded. As much as feasible. But perfect shielding is perfect blindness, and this is not the kind of neighborhood where you want to keep your eyes closed. Actually, it was, but I took her point. I took her other point, too, the one she didn't speak out loud. And you missed it. Something sitting right there in consensus for anyone to see. Top-of-the-line synthesist like you. Sodasti knows what he's doing, I guess, I admitted, endlessly aware that he might be listening. He hasn't been wrong yet, as far as we know. As far as we can know, Bates said. If you can second-guess a vampire, you wouldn't need a vampire, I remembered. She smiled faintly. Isaac was a good man. You can't always believe the PR, though. You don't buy it? I asked, but she was already thinking she said too much. I threw out a hook baited with just the right mix of skepticism and deference. Sodasti did know where those scramblers would be. Nailed it almost to the meter, out of that whole maze. I suppose that might have taken some superhuman logic, she admitted. thinking I was so fucking dumb she couldn't believe it. "What?" I said. Bates shrugged. Or maybe he just realized that since Rorschach was growing its own crew, we'd run into it more every time we went in, no matter where we landed. Consensus bleeped into my silence. "Orbital maneuvers starting in 5, Sonosti announced. "Inlays and wireless prosthetics offline in 90. That's all." Bates shut down the display. "I'm going to ride this out on the bridge. Illusion of control and all that. You?" "My tent, I think." She nodded and braced to jump and hesitated. "By the way," she told me. "Yes." "Sorry?" "You asked if I thought the emplacements were necessary. Right now I think we need all the protection we can get." "So you think that Rorschach might... Hey, it already killed me once." She wasn't talking about radiation. I nodded carefully. "That must have been... like nothing at all. You couldn't possibly imagine." Bates took a breath and let it out. "Maybe you don't have to," she added, and sailed away up the spine. Cunningham and the gang in Biomed, 30 degrees of arc between them. Each poked their captives in their own way. Susan James stabbed indifferently at a keypad painted across her desktop. Windows to either side looked in on Stretch and Clench. Cookie-cutter shapes scrolled across the desk as James typed. Circles, triskelions, a quartet of parallel lines. Some of them pulsed like abstract little hearts. In his distant pen, Stretch reached out one fraying tentacle and tapped something in turn. "Any progress?" She sighed and shook her head. "I've given up trying to understand their language. I'm settling for a pigeon." She tapped an icon. Clench vanished from his window. A hieroglyphic flowchart sprang up in his place. Half the symbols wriggled or pulsed, endlessly repetitive, a riot of dancing noodles. Others just sat there. "Iconic base." James waved vaguely at the display. Subject-verb phrases render as animated versions of noun icons. They're radially symmetrical, so I array modifiers in a circular pattern around the central subject. Maybe that comes naturally to them. A new circle of glyphs appeared beneath James's. Stretch's reply, presumably. But something in the system didn't like what it saw. Icons flared in a separate window. A luminous counter flashed 500 watts and held steady. On the screen, Stretch writhed. It reached out with squirming backbone arms and stabbed repeatedly at its touchpad. James looked away. New glyphs appeared. 500 watts retreated to 0. Stretch returned to its holding pattern, the spikes and jags of its telemetry smoothed. James let out her breath. "What happened?" I asked. "Wrong answer." She tapped into Stretch's feed, showed me the display that had tripped it up. A pyramid, a star, a simplified representations of a scrambler and of Rorschach rotated on the board. It was stupid. It was just a warm-up exercise, really. I asked it to name the objects in the window. She laughed softly and without humor. That's the thing about functional languages, you know. If you can't point at it, you can't talk about it. And what did it say? She pointed at Stretch's first spiral. Polyhedron star Rorschach are present. It missed the scrambler. Got it right the second time. Still, stupid mistake for something that can think rings around a vampire, isn't it? Susan swallowed. I guess even scramblers slip up when they're dying. I didn't know what to say. Behind me, barely audible, Cunningham muttered some two-stroke mantra to himself in an endless loop. Yuka says... Susan stopped, began again. You know that Blindsight we get sometimes in Rorschach? I nodded and wondered what Yuka had said. Apparently the same thing can happen to the other senses too, she told me. You can have blind touch and blind smell and blind hearing. That would be deafness. She shook her head. But it isn't really, is it? Any more than blind sight is really blindness. Something in your head is still taking it all in. Something in the brain is still seeing and hearing even if you're not aware of it. Unless someone forces you to guess, or there's some threat, you just get a really strong feeling you should move out of the way, and 5 seconds later a bus drives over the spot you were standing. You knew it was coming somehow. You just don't know how you knew. It's wild, I agreed. These scramblers, they know the answers, Siri. They're intelligent, we know they are. But it's almost as though they don't know they know unless you hurt them. As if they had got blind sight spread over every sense. I tried to imagine it. Life without sensation, without any active awareness of one's environment. I tried to imagine existing like that without going mad. Do you think that's possible? I don't know. It's just a metaphor, I guess. She didn't believe that. Or she didn't know. Or she didn't want me to know. I should have been able to tell. She should have been clear. At first I thought they were just resisting, she said, but why would they? She turned bright, begging eyes on me, pleading for an answer. I didn't have one. I didn't have a clue. I turned away from Susan James, only to find myself facing Robert Cunningham. Cunningham the mutterer, fingers tapped against tabletop interfaces, inner eyes blinded, vision limited now to the picture's consensus sketched in airspace or through against flat surfaces for everyone to see. His face remained as empty as a feeling as it had ever been. The rest of his body twitched like a bug in a spider web. He might as well have been. We all might. Rorschach loomed barely 9 kilometers away now, so near it might have eclipsed Ben itself if I'd been brave enough to look outside. We had closed to this insane proximity and parked. Out there, Rorschach grew like a live thing. In there, live things grew, budded like jellyfish from some demonic mechanical substrate. Those lethal vacant corridors we'd crept along, frightened of the shadows planted in our heads, they were probably filling with scramblers right now. All those hundreds of kilometers of twisted tunnels and passages and chambers filling with an army. This was Sadasti's safer alternative. This was the path we'd followed because it would have been too dangerous to release the prisoners. We were so deep inside the bow shock that we'd had to shut down our internal augments. While Rorschach's magnetosphere was orders of magnitude weaker here than within the structure itself, who knew if the alien might find us too tempting a target, or too great a threat at this range? Who knew when it might choose to plunge some invisible spike through Theseus's heart? Any pulse that could penetrate the ship's shielding would doubtlessly fry Theseus' nervous system, as well as the wiring in our heads. I suppose that 5 people in a dead ship would have a marginally greater chance of survival if their brains weren't sparking in the bargain, but I doubted that such a difference would make much difference. Sadasti had obviously figured the odds differently. He'd even shut down the anti-Euclidean pump in his own head, resorted to manual injections to keep himself from short-circuiting. Stretch and Clench were even closer to Rorschach than we were. Cunningham's lab had been kicked free of the ship. It floated now just a few kilometers from the artifact's outermost spires, deep within the folds of its magnetic field. If the scramblers needed radioactive magnetite to function, this was the key they were going to get. A taste of the fields, but not of freedom. The lab shielding was being dynamically fine-tuned to balance medical necessity against tactical risk, as best the data allowed. The structure floated in the watchful crosshairs of our newborn gun emplacements, strategically positioned to either side. Those emplacements could destroy the hab in an instant. They could probably destroy anything approaching it as well. They couldn't destroy Rorschach, of course. Maybe nothing could. Covert to invulnerable. As far as we knew, that hadn't happened yet. Presumably, Theseus could still do something about the artifact accreting off our bow, assuming we could decide which thing to do. Sadasti wasn't talking. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time any of us had seen the vampire in the flesh. For several shifts now, he had confined himself to his tent, speaking only through consensus. Everyone was on edge, and the transient had gone quiet. Cunningham muttered to himself, stabbed at unfamiliar controls with unpracticed fingers, cursed his own clumsiness. Stimulus and response flowed through the lasers across 6 kilometers of ionized vacuum. The ever-present nicotine stick hung from one corner of his mouth for want of a free hand. Every now and then, flecks of ash broke free and drifted obliquely toward the ventilators. He spoke before I could. It's all in consensus. When I didn't leave, he relented, but wouldn't look at me. Magnetite flecks lined up as soon as they got past the wavefront, more or less. Membranes started to fix themselves. They're not failing as fast, but it's Rorschach's internal environment that will be optimized for scrambler metabolism. Out here, I think the most we can do is slow the rate of dying. That's something, at least. Cunningham grunted. Some of the pieces are coming together. Others, their nerves are frayed for no good reason. Literally, single leakage along the cables. Because of the deterioration, I guessed. And I can't get the Arrhenius equation to balance. There's all this non-linearly at low temperatures. The pre-exponential value's completely fucked up. It's almost as though temperature doesn't matter, and... shit. Some critical value had exceeded a confidence limit on one of his displays. He glanced up at the drum and raised his voice. Need another biopsy, Susan. Anywhere central. What? Oh, just a second. She shook her head and tapped off a brief spiral of icons, as listless as the captive she commanded. On one of Cunningham's windows, Stretch viewed her input with its marvelous sighted skin. It floated unresponsive for a moment. Then it folded back, the arms facing one wall, opening a clear path for Cunningham's teleops. He called 2 of them from their burrows like prehensile serpents. The first wielded a clinical core sampler. The second wielded the threat of violence in case of foolish resistance. It was hardly necessary. Blindsighted or not, scramblers were fast learners. Stretch exposed its belly like a victim resigned to imminent rape. Cunningham fumbled. The teleops bumped together, briefly entangled. He cursed and tried again, every move shouting frustration. His extended phenotype had been amputated. Once the very ghost in the machine, now he was just another guy punching buttons, and suddenly something clicked. Cunningham's facade swirled to translucency before my eyes. Suddenly, I could almost imagine him. He got it right the second time. The tip of his machine shot out like a striking snake and darted back again, almost too fast to see. Waves of color flushed from Stretch's injury like ripples chased across still water by a falling stone. Cunningham must have thought he saw something in my face. "It helps if you try not to think of them as people," he said. And for the very first time I could read the subtext, as clear and as sharp as broken glass. Of course, you don't think of anyone that way. Cunningham didn't like to be played. No one does. But most people don't think that's what I'm doing. They don't know how much their bodies betray when they close their mouths. When they speak aloud, it's because they want to confide. When they don't, they think they're keeping their opinions to themselves. I watch them so closely, customize each word so that no system ever feels used, and yet for some reason that didn't work with Robert Cunningham. I think I was modeling the wrong system. Imagine you are a synthesist. You deal in the behavior of systems at their surfaces, infer the machinery beneath from its reflections above. That is the secret of your success. You understand the system by understanding the boundaries that contain it. Now imagine you encounter someone who has ripped a hole in those boundaries and bled beyond them. Robert Cunningham's flesh could not contain him. His duties pulled him beyond the meat sack. Here in the Ort, his topology rambled all over the ship. That was true of all of us to some extent. Bates and her drones, Sadasti and his limbic link, even the consensus inlays in our heads diffused us a bit, spread us just slightly beyond the confines of our own bodies. But Bates only ran her drones. She never inhabited them. The Gang of Four may have run multiple systems on a single motherboard, but each had its own distinct topology, and they only ever surfaced one at a time. And Sadasti was a whole different story, as it turned out. Cunningham didn't just operate his remotes. He escaped into them, wore them like a secret identity to hide the feeble human baseline within. He had sacrificed half of his neocortex for the chance to see X-rays and taste the shapes hiding in cell membranes. He had butchered one body to become a fleeting tenant of many. Pieces of him hid in the sensors and manipulators that lined the scramblers' cages. I might have gleaned vital clues from every piece of equipment in the subdrum if I'd ever thought to look. Cunningham was a topological jigsaw like everyone else, but half his pieces were hidden in machinery. My model was incomplete. I don't think he ever aspired to such a state. Looking back, I see radiant self-loathing on every remembered surface. But there in the waning years of the 21st century, the only alternative he could see was the life of a parasite. Cunningham merely chose the lesser evil. Now even that was denied him. Sadasti's orders had severed him from his own sensorium. He no longer felt the data in his gut. He had to interpret it, step by laborious step, through the screens and graphs that reduced perception to flat, empty shorthand. Here was a system traumatized by multiple amputations. Here was a system with its eyes and ears and tongue cut out, forced to stumble and feel its way around things it had once inhabited, right down to the bone. Suddenly there was nowhere else to hide, and all those far-flung pieces of Robert Cunningham tumbled back into his flesh, where I could see them at last. It had been my mistake all along. I'd been so focused on modeling other systems that I'd forgotten about the one doing the modeling. Bad eyes are only one bane of clear vision. Bad assumptions can be just as blinding, and it wasn't enough to imagine I was Robert Cunningham. I had to imagine I was Siri Keaton as well. Of course, that only raises another question. If my guess about Cunningham was right, why did my tricks work on Isaac Spindle? He was every bit as discontinuous as his replacement. I didn't think about it much at the time. Spindle was gone, but the thing that had killed him was still there, hanging right off the bow, a vast swelling enigma that might choose to squash us at any instant. I was more than a little preoccupied. Now, though, far too late to do anything about it, I think I might know the answer. Maybe my tricks didn't work on Isaac either, not really. Maybe he saw through my manipulations as easy as Cunningham did. But maybe he just didn't care. Maybe I could read him because he let me. Which would mean I can't find another explanation that fits. That he just liked me, regardless. I think that might have made him a friend. If I can but make the words awake the feeling. Ian Anderson, stand up. Night shift. Not a creature was stirring. Not in Theseus, anyway. The gang hid in their tent. The transient lurked weightless and silent below the surface. Bates was in the bridge. She more or less lived up there now, vigilant and conscientious, nested in camera angles and tactical overlays. There was nowhere she could turn without seeing some aspect of the cipher off our starboard bow. She did what good she could for the good it would do. The drum turned quietly, lights dimmed in deference to a dial cycle that 100 years of tweaks and retrofits hadn't been able to weed from the genes. I sat alone in the galley, squinting from the inside of a system whose outlines grew increasingly hazy, trying to compile my latest, how would Isaac put it? Postcard to posterity. Cunningham worked upside down on the other side of the world. Except Cunningham wasn't working. He hadn't even moved for at least 4 minutes. I'd assumed he was reciting the Kaddish for Spindle. Consensus said he'd been doing it twice daily for the next year, if we lived that long. But now, leaning to see around the spinal bundles in the core, I could read his surfaces as clearly as if I'd been sitting beside him. He wasn't bored or distracted or even deep in thought. Robert Cunningham was petrified. I stood and paced the drum. Ceiling turned into wall, wall into floor. I was close enough to hear his incessant stop muttering, a single indistinct syllable repeated over and over, that I was close enough to hear what he was saying. Fuck, 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 fuck. And still Cunningham didn't move, although I'd made no attempt to mask my approach. Finally, when I was almost at his shoulder, he fell silent. You're blind, he said without turning. Did you know that? I didn't. You, me, everyone. He interlocked his fingers and clenched as if in prayer, hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Only then did I notice. No cigarette. Vision's mostly a lie anyway, he continued. We don't really see anything except a few high-res degrees where the eye focuses. Everything else is just a peripheral blur, just light and motion. Motion draws the focus, and your eyes jiggle all the time. Did you know that, Keaton? Saccades, they're called. Blurs the image. The movement's way too fast for the brain to integrate, so your eye just shuts down between pauses. It only grabs those isolated freeze frames, but your brain edits out the blanks and stitches in an illusion of continuity into your head. He turned to face me. And you know what's really amazing? If something only moves during the gaps, your brain just ignores it. It's invisible. I glanced at his workspace. The usual split screen glowed to one side, real-time images of the scramblers and their pens, but histology, 10,000 times larger than life, took center stage. The paradoxical neural architecture of stretch and clench glistened on the main window, flensed and labeled and overlaid by circuit diagrams a dozen layers thick. A dense annotated forest of alien trunks and brambles. It looked a little bit like Rorschach itself. I couldn't parse any of it. Are you listening, Keaton? Do you know what I'm saying? You figured out why I couldn't... You're saying these things can somehow tell when our eyes are offline, and... I didn't finish. It just didn't seem possible. Cunningham shook his head. Something that sounded disturbingly like a giggle escaped his mouth. I'm saying these things can see your nerves firing from across the room and integrate that into a crypsis strategy, and then send motor commands to act on that strategy, and then send other commands to stop the motion before your eyes come back online. All in the time it would take a mammalian nerve impulse to make it halfway from your shoulder to your elbow. These things are fast, Keaton. Way faster than we could have guessed, even from that high-speed whisper line they were using. They're bloody superconductors. It took a conscious effort to keep from frowning. Is that even possible? Every nerve impulse generates an electromagnetic field. That makes it detectable. But Rorschach's EM fields are so... reading the firing of a single optic nerve through all that interference... It's not interference. The fields are part of them, remember? That's probably how they do it. So they couldn't do that here. You're not listening. The trap you set wouldn't have caught anything like that, not unless it wanted to be caught. We didn't grab specimens at all. We grabbed spies. Stretch and clench floated in split screen before us, arms swaying like undulating backbones. Cryptic patterns played slowly across their cuticles. Supposing it's just instinct, I suggested. Flounders hide their background pretty well, but they don't think about it. Where are they going to get that instinct from, Keaton? How is it going to evolve? Saccades are an accidental glitch in mammalian vision. Where would scramblers have encountered them before now? Cunningham shook his head. That thing Amanda's robot fried, it developed that strategy on its own, on the spot. It improvised. The word intelligent barely encompassed that kind of improvisation. But there was something else in Cunningham's face, some deeper distress nested inside what he'd already told me. What? I asked. It was stupid, he said. The things these creatures can do, it was just dumb. How do you mean? Well, it didn't work, did it? Couldn't keep it up in front of more than one or two of us. Because people's eyes don't flicker in sync, I realized. Too many witnesses stripped it of cover. Many other things it could have done, Cunningham was saying. They could have induced antons, or in agnosia, then we could have tripped over a whole herd of scramblers and it wouldn't even register in our conscious minds. Agnosias happen by accident, for God's sake. If you've got the stress and reflexes to hide between someone's saccades, why stop there? Why not do something that really works? Why do you think? I asked, reflexively non-directive. I think that the first one was, it was a juvenile, right? Maybe it was just inexperienced. Maybe it was stupid and it made a bad decision. I think we're dealing with a species so far beyond us that even their retarded children can rewire our brains on the fly, and I can't tell you how fucking scared that should make you. I could see it in his topology. I could hear it in his voice. His nerveless face remained as calm as a corpse. We should just kill them now, he said. Well, if they're spies, they can't have learned much. They've been in those cages the whole time, except for the way up. They'd been right next to us for the whole trip back. These things live and breathe EM. Even stunted, even isolated. Who knows how much of our tech they could have just read through the walls? You've got to tell Sadasti, I said. Oh, Sadasti knows. Why do you think he wouldn't let them go? He never said anything about... He'd be crazy to fill us in. He keeps sending you down there, remember? Do you think for a second he'd tell you what he knows and then set you loose in a labyrinth full of mind-reading minotaurs? He knows, and he's already got it factored 1,000 ways to Sunday. Cunningham's eyes were bright manic points blazing in an expressionless mask. He raised them to the center of the drum, and he didn't raise his voice a decibel. Isn't that right, Yuka? I checked consensus for active channels. I don't think he's listening, Robert. Cunningham's mouth moved in something that would have been a pitying smile if the rest of the face had been able to join in. He doesn't have to listen, Keaton. He doesn't have to spy on us. He just knows. Ventilators breathing. The almost subliminal hum of bearings in motion. Then Sadasti's disembodied voice rang forth through the drum. Everyone to commons. Robert wants to share. Cunningham sat to my right, his plastic face lit from beneath by the conference table. He stared down into that light, rocking slightly. His lips went through the ongoing motions of some inaudible incantation. The gang sat across from us. To my left, Bates kept one eye on the proceedings and another on intelligence from the front lines. Sadasti was with us only in spirit. His place at the head of the table remained empty. Tell them, he said. We have to get out of... from the beginning. Cunningham swallowed and started again. Those frayed motor nerves I couldn't figure out, those pointless cross-connections. They're logic gates. Scramblers' timeshare. Their sensory and motor plexi double as associative neurons during idle time, so every part of the system can be used for cognition when it isn't otherwise engaged. Nothing like it ever evolved on Earth. It means they can do a great deal of processing without a lot of dedicated associative mass, even for an individual. So peripheral nerves can think, Bates frowned. Can they remember? Certainly. At least I don't see why not. Cunningham pulled a cigarette from his pocket. So when they tore that scrambler apart, not Civil War. Data dump. Passing information about us, most likely. Pretty radical way to carry on a conversation, Bates remarked. It wouldn't be their first choice. I think each scrambler acts as a node in a distributed network, when they're in Rorschach at least. But those fields would be configured down to the angstrom, and when we go in with our tech and shielding and blowing holes in their conductors, we bollocks up the network. Jam the local signal. So they resort to a sneaker net. He had not lit his cigarette. He rolled the filtered end between thumb and forefinger. His tongue flickered between his lips like a worm behind a mask. Hidden in his tent, Sadasti took up the slack. Scramblers also use Rorschach's EM for metabolic processes. Some pathways achieve proton transfer via heavy atom tunneling. Perhaps the ambient radiation acts as a catalyst. Tunneling? Susan said. As in quantum? Cunningham nodded. Which also explains your shielding problems, partly at least. But is that even possible? I mean, I thought those kind of effects only showed up under cryonic... Forget this, Cunningham blurted. We can debate the biochemistry later if we're still alive. What do we debate instead, Robert? Sodasti said smoothly. For starters, the dumbest of these things can look into your head and see what parts of your visual cortex are lighting up. And if there's a difference between that and mind reading, it's not much of one. As long as we stay out of Rorschach. That ship has sailed. You people have already been there. Repeatedly. Who knows what you already did down there, for no better reason than because Rorschach made you. Wait a second, Bates objected. None of us were puppets down there. We hallucinated and we went blind and crazy even, but we were never possessed. Cunningham looked at her and snorted. You think you'd be able to fight the strings? You think you'd even feel them? I could apply a transcranial magnet to your head right now, and you'd raise your middle finger or wiggle your toes or kick Siri here in the sack and then swear on your sainted mother's grave that you only did it because you wanted to. You'd dance like a puppet and all the time swear you were doing it of your own free will, and that's just me. That's just some borderline OCD with a couple of magnets and an MRI helmet. He waved at the vast unknowable void beyond the bulkhead. Shreds of mangled cigarette floated sideways in front of him. Do you want to guess what that can do? For all we know, we've already given them Theseus technical specs, warned them about the Icarus array, and then just decided of our own free will to forget it all. We can cause those effects, Sodasti said coolly. As you say, strokes cause them. Tumors. Random accidents. Random? Those were experiments, people. That was vivisection. They let you in so they could take you apart and see what made you tick, and you never even knew it. So what? The vampire snapped invisibly. Something cold and hungry had edged into his voice. Human topology shivered around the table, skittish. There is a blind spot in the center of your visual field, Sodasti pointed out. You can't see it. You can't see the saccades in your visual time stream. Just two of the tricks you know about. Many others. Cunningham was nodding. That's my whole point. Rorschach could be... Not talking about case studies. Brains are survival engines, not truth detectors. If self-deception promotes fitness, the brain lies, stops noticing irrelevant things. Truth never matters, only fitness. By now, you don't experience the world as it exists at all. You experience a simulation built from assumptions, shortcuts, lies. Whole species is agnostics by default. Rorschach does nothing to you that you don't already do to yourselves. Nobody spoke. It was several silent seconds before I realized what had happened. Yuka Sodasti had just given us a pep talk. He could have shut down Cunningham's tirade, could have probably shut down a full-scale mutiny, by just sailing into our midst and baring his teeth, by looking at us. But he wasn't trying to frighten us into submission. We were already nervous enough. And he wasn't trying to educate us either, fight fear with fact. The more facts any sane person gathered about Rorschach, the more fearful they'd become. Sodasti was only trying to keep us functional, lost in space at the edge of our lives, facing down this monstrous enigma that might destroy us at any instant for any reason. Sodasti was trying to calm us down. Good meat. Nice meat. He was trying to keep us from falling apart. There. Sodasti was practicing psychology. I looked around the table. Bates and Cunningham and the gang sat still and motionless. Sodasti sucked at it. We have to get out of here, Cunningham said. These things are way beyond us. We've shown more aggression than they have, James said, but there was no confidence in her voice. Rorschach plays those rocks like marbles. We're sitting in the middle of a shooting gallery. Anytime it feels like... It's still growing. It's not finished. That's supposed to reassure me? All I'm saying is we don't know, James said. We could have years yet, centuries. We have 15 days, Sodasti announced. Oh shit, someone said. Cunningham probably. Maybe Sasha. For some reason, everyone was looking at me. 15 days. Who knows what had gone into that number? None of us had asked aloud. Maybe Sodasti, in another fit of inept psychology, had made it up on the spur of the moment. Or maybe he derived it before we'd even reached orbit, held it back against the possibility, only now expired, that he might yet send us back into the labyrinth. I'd been half blind for half the mission. I didn't know. But one way or another, we had our graduation day.